my treatise is to create a world that is just and fair. And to create a world that's just and fair, then you have to have a respect for our humanity, the humanity of the other, the humanity of each and every one of us. And you have to have economic systems that respect the humanity of people. That means that you can't have trafficking. That means you can't be just saying you avoid taxation and you go offshore and you find fancy ways of avoiding your taxation. Those illicit flows of money are in fact inimical to human rights, because in the end they always involve exploitation. They also involve a failure, therefore, to have the resource, for nations to have the resource in which they can pay for universal health care, where they can pay for the elderly who need care in our communities, where you can pay for all those things. If there isn't a pot of money in the middle to do that, some of those things that you need to do collectively, you're not going to be able to create a fair and just world. And so for me, it's about human rights cannot stand alone and separate as some nice other thing from the whole business of what law is about. You'll remember, and the story has been told often here at Hay, in different tents of history, of politics, of Philippe Sands talking about his wonderful book about how human rights law dealt with the trials at Nuremberg. And the answer to all of this is that you can't create good law in order to, and the rules by which we live with each other and regulate our coexistence, if it isn't infused with human rights. So I always say to people, human rights are not just about lawyers. Human rights are about how we deal with our next door neighbour, how we relate to our children and our beloveds in our intimate relationships. It's how we deal with the people in our workforce or that we work with. It's how we deal with our neighbouring country as well as our neighbouring communities. And so it's actually about a treatise for respect, for mutual respect and the loving of others. And when you think about it in that way, suddenly law becomes a much more attractive thing, I have to tell you. It's where the law becomes poetry, in my view. And one of the problems we have is that half the populations around the world do not get a fair shout when it comes to the issue of justice. And so if I were putting anything on the wall on that chapel, it would be saying, what are we really doing about the position of women the world over, but even here in the United Kingdom? And I'll turn to that in a minute. As a human rights lawyer, my whole work now is looking at some of the big challenges that there are in the world, which come out of a globalized neoliberal economic model, which in many ways has taken people out of poverty in some of the developing world, but is in fact turning increasingly the first world into a world that is much more like the third world, because we have, in our efforts to lower taxation, to drive down the size of the state, to make it small, to have less rules. We've got to get rid of regulation is the great mantra. To get rid of trade unions that were far too powerful. Look who's powerful now. We can make a list of who's powerful now. And the ways in which we hear the announcement from politicians that we've got more jobs than ever before, and ask yourself what those jobs are like, what the quality of those jobs are, whether they do involve a respectful way of treating workers and whether they're properly being rewarded. Because the unprotection of workers is one of the great problems in our contemporary world. And so, in order to deal with the human rights of people, you do have to have an economic system that actually has at its heart respect for human rights too. There's the great challenges of climate change. I sat recently on an international commission that was looking at climate change and human rights. And all I can tell you is that as we look at the refugee problems that there are, and we can't use the word refugee because refugee were people fleeing from persecution, but we're actually seeing huge movements of people increasingly because of climate change, where Central Africa is becoming a desert, drying out, where you cannot grow enough to feed communities. And people who are poor, as they always have done, gather their bits of money together and give it to their oldest son as the person to make a break and to go to the parts of the world where they might be able to make a survival and perhaps bring some of their brothers and sisters to join them eventually. And so you're seeing more and more movements of people fleeing from the impoverishment that comes as a result of climate change. The rising seas, meaning that people are driven from places where they had livelihoods on the sea's edges and then move towards cities in the north, and increasing numbers of people moving, fleeing from the disasters that are going to follow from climate change. And yet still there is denial of the contribution that man and woman has made to that, particularly in the developed world, by the things that we take for granted. And the refusal by big corporates like the oil industry, the coal industry, and so on, to recognize that there has to be some alternative to the ways that we've been living in recent times. The whole issue of corporates with regard to how the moving to places where you can make grander profits, also often involves abuses of human rights, where the kind of things that we would take for granted about health and safety, much dismissed as being about protecting the interests of workers, doesn't exist in those sweatshops in Bangladesh that produce the clothes that we buy in Primark and in cheap outlets. And you'll remember the Rana Plaza disaster, where many, many hundreds of women were killed or suffered incredible maiming and disablement because the building collapsed on them. And in those buildings, and I visited them, you'll see that there are kerosene stoves, people cook in them, the provision of food is done in the places, and fumes are present all the time, and the risk of those places going up in flames is huge, as well as collapsing because they've not been built in ways that are satisfactory. And yet, it is many of the places that we buy our clothes from that are allowing all of that to happen. Rana Plaza put a shock through the whole business of the clothing industry. But have we seen enough change? And I'm not sure that we have. The scandals of what happened in the Niger Delta, the business of Bhopal in India, the ways in which in Latin America oil drilling has contaminated the aquifer and also led to poisoning of the earth, so that many of the children are now suffering from genetic disease and so on as a result of the failure of oil companies, usually American oil companies, to reach the standards that would be expected of them back in the developed world. The whole business of the trafficking of workers, and that we see this. Again, I conducted an inquiry for Scotland recently into trafficking. And it was not just trafficking for sex purposes, it was trafficking also for labour in some of the places where gang masters were bringing people in for incredibly low wages from low wage economies where you're still going to be earning more here, and having them live in the most disgusting conditions and paying them little and considering them to be self-employed so that they didn't have any of the kind of protections or anything that you might have expected in ordinary workforces. And I'm afraid those things go on even here in the United Kingdom. The way in which human rights has got to be invoked when it comes to dealing with the treatment of women the world over. And it's not just in other places, but also here. Issues like domestic violence, like the failures around the prosecution of rapes and the victimization of women and children in a sexual way. The whole business of the scandal we've had recently about sexual harassment is about a failure of law, and yet we've removed legal aid, and so the possibilities of taking actions are often not open to women. And because they're not unionized, they aren't usually in part of the work economy where their union will take a case in the industrial tribunals. Women are a major part of the gig economy, and women have been part of the gig economy forever and a day, working low wage, working under the counter, receiving money for cleaning, for working where they do home sewing, where they're provided with a sewing machine, which they then in turn have to rent, and then are producing piecemeal jeans and so on in tiny council flats in the East End of London. the whole business of how the internet has now been used in ways which actually make the lives of women particularly miserable. You only have to be a woman who is in politics or writes in newspapers or puts their head above the parapet on any front, and the amount of abuse that they get and misogyny and really vile stuff on the internet is horrifying. But there's also the business of how the internet is being used. And when I say grooming, I'm not just talking about grooming in the terms that we think of for sexual purposes, but changing the way in which the conversation about sexuality takes place for our young.